The animation is finally finished, ready for takeoff. It's time for it to break out. Whoa. First, you want to know how I did it? Welcome to the process of a former Blender dummy who learned to model, shade, texture paint, rig, and weight paint a 3D character with the help of a tutorial series. Prepared to have your perception of perfection shattered and the flaws of my animation revealed. You can shoulder shimmy. That's disturbing. Alongside creating the character, we'll watch as the story unfolds of the journey to creating the scene animation, and of course revealing the full version of that animation at the end. May the process commence! It's the Lily Factor! Ding! In 2019, I made a visit to Zag Studios and spoke with some people who worked there. A man named Sebastian asked me if I had heard of the free 3D animation program called Blender. I didn't recognize the name, so when I got home, I immediately grabbed my sister's computer and started looking into the software, watching tutorials on how to navigate the interface. Overall, I wanted to learn to create characters in Blender and animate them. I began looking for a course that could teach me just that, and I even took a Blender course, but that picture pretty much sums it up. It wasn't until Darius's channel here gave me just the tutorial series I was looking for. Thank you, Darius. I'm making a hand. I was very excited to start modeling, and I'm going to talk more about these sort of things in detail, but first I'm going to talk about the texture painting. You mark seams on the character to unwrap it. Think about it like unfolding a box to figure out how to place the painting colors onto the character. During this process, I couldn't figure out how to color what I had selected on his eyes. I was getting confused and frustrated because I'd been working on it a while, so I ended up clicking out. I clicked out of Blender 3 seconds before I got to the part of the tutorial that says, remember to save your texture paint before you click out, because Blender does not do it for you. So I lost all the texture painting I had done, and I handled it like a champ, cried for a good long time. But then I thought I could either just sit here in defeat or I could get up and fix my mistake. In the process of re-texture painting, I learned how to recover saved files, which came in handy later on when my computer would kick me out before I saved anything. But it also ended up taking significantly less time to texture paint. I also did some shading, toon shading before I did the texture painting to give him that cartoony look. Gave him a red outline solely around his face, started rigging him. But the funny thing was to touch back on the Blender course I made a crack at earlier. It was a 5-day course at one of the top 10 animation schools teaching how to create a video game in Blender, which looking back on it was way over promising. But the teacher didn't know how to navigate the interface at all and was watching tutorial videos before the lessons the next day. He didn't really teach anything. One of the few things he lightly mentioned was texture painting. So out of the one thing I could have gotten out of that course is the thing I forgot. I mean, we must have spent hours just free-for-alling in front of the computers. Unbelievable. And that was my texture painting story. And it all went wrong because I forgot to hit one button when I was coloring the eyes. So I showed some rigging stuff, but now I'm showing new rigging stuff. Basically, I had made the rig, set it up, I even fixed some weight painting issues, but then I realized there was something wrong with the head bone in the rig, and while I did technically fix it, I hadn't realized I'd fixed it yet. So I ended up just starting all over with the rig. And then I started again and realized I never put the model back in its rest position, so I started over again. In hindsight, I didn't need to start over twice or at all. The blessing in disguise was it gave me a chance to fix the modeling on his back quills there. As you can see on the left, the new version versus the old version on the right. It definitely looks more like he has quills on his back than before, where it was just kind of spikes on his back. But I finally get into the final version of my rigging there, getting the bones put together. And I guess that was the other blessing in disguise about it, is I got to actually show more of how I did the rigging and creating the bones and moving them around and pressing that inaugural generate rig button to take those bones and put them into little shapes to move the rig around. And then it goes into trying to figure out, does everything move properly? Do the bones rotate correctly? If they don't, rotate the bones so then you can test it out, see if they move as they should. All that good stuff. Really, these things I had more freedom in the sense that I didn't have to do everything. The rig was built into Blender, this kind of human rig, so I was more tweaking it. I used automatic weights, which did have some problems where you move his arm down and his face kind of stretched out with it, so I had to go into weight painting with the rig also selected and select the guilty bones that were weight painted to the face that shouldn't have been, and erase the weight painting in there, because that's essentially the weight painting is telling the rig what things need to bend and stretch between the joints of each bone. Then I moved on to troubleshooting some weight painting issues with the head, deleting all the wrong bones associated with parts of the head and only assigning the head bone to the parts of the head. So that way all the weight is going to just the head bone, so when he rotates his head, it does what it should and doesn't squish in a disturbing way. See, isn't that nice and kid-friendly? It's like a little baby in their crib. You can see I've moved him around and he doesn't look that creepy, except for, you know, the fact that I gave him kind of a weird pose. Did a lot of exploration moving the rig around, trying to figure out what things weren't working, and the big culprit of that was the shoes and the hands. Oh my gosh, the hands. This is basically one of those things where the automatic weights did not track how I modeled the hands, so I had to do the weight painting myself, which I guess was good because it taught me how to do weight painting. I don't think I did the best job, but it was definitely helping me figure out how to get the weights associated with the correct fingers and not the two opposite fingers of the finger that should have been moving with the bone. Still have more to learn about weight painting, but at least the fingers bend somewhat as they should. And then I figured out how to do a constraint that could keep the boot straps from melding weirdly when I moved the foot, so I fixed that issue. So then it came time to start creating a new mouth that actually had teeth and a tongue, because the old mouth was just like a filler, because this new mouth is going to be so I can rig it. So I set everything up to give it the right paint colors, and then I moved the new mouth into place and I remodeled it. Doesn't it look nice compared to the old version? Created some eyelids, gave those a rig. This is around the point where incentive ducks were introduced. I wasn't working in Blender that regularly, and I'll talk more about the timing of it, but I came across these ducks that I thought were kind of cute, and I have a lot of birds on my animation desk, so I thought they'd make a fun addition, but I felt kind of silly buying them, so I was like, well, what if I get them, but I can work, but I have to work them off, so they're incentive ducks. So I had to work an hour every day in Blender for a week to earn my incentive ducks. And I did it. Mission accomplished. The power of incentive ducks. You wanna see something stupid? He's like, hey, 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 hey. Would you look at that, folks? He's a tad confused. He's given the sly brow. And now he's angry. I tried to keep some of that shape of his brow peeking out so you get that kind of light hitting it. Very mad. He's a little sad because I haven't animated him. We're at the point where I started creating shape keys for the eyes and the mouth. To edit the mouth, every time I tabbed into edit mode, it was that weird circle, but thanks to one YouTube comment on the tutorial video, I figured out the solution to that so I could edit the mouth, move it around to create these different shapes, as you can see here, and then mirror them and adjust the teeth accordingly. Basically, what I'm doing here is I'm remodeling the mouth to give it different shapes, but still keeping the original mouth. And then I can create bones in the rig and create a shape, parent it to the rig, and then adjust the shape size to display whatever corner of the mouth that my shape key represents, and then add a driver to the shape key to command the shape key to be parented to the bone, so that whenever the bone moves on, depending on the axis you want it to move on, it'll move and create the shape of the mouth. And the shape key This is not a tutorial, so I don't know why I'm trying to explain this. If you really want to understand all of this, go to Darius's tutorial series, because that's how I learned it. I wouldn't have known any of these things otherwise, but I could only angle the different expressions I gave him on like one corner of the mouth. So I couldn't have him smiling both ways. I could only have him kind of grinning or frowning on one side. I don't know enough about mouth rigging and shape keys to do that. So I just settled for different corners of the mouth, realizing that I wasn't going to actually make him talk or anything. And then I created the rig for the eyes. So the rig was pretty much done. Then I added my own flair to the eyes, paint some more life in them. You can shoulder shimmy. That's disturbing. You can rotate his hips too. That's also disturbing. Check this out. With the space bar. And oh. Alright, now we're seeing the action. Now I'm putting this monitor to use here. With all the work in the tutorial series done, I entered uncharted territory and started animating. Except I noticed one little thing when I moved that foot. There was some weird bend on that foot. Yeah, I still had weight painting issues with the shoes. So I had to go back in, fix that, and then start animating. I wanted to do my first animation as kind of like a test run to learn how to animate in Blender and just 3D animate in general. I've done 2D animation, but 3D animation is not something I'm that familiar with, especially in terms of character animation. So this was a first for me. There wasn't a part in the tutorial series of making Sonic for animation, so this was more uncharted territory for me. And I decided to start with just a walk cycle, basically blocking out some poses, letting the computer fill in the gaps, and then adjusting accordingly. It was fine at the beginning, but it just didn't have a good sense of weight. Instead of a reference, I pulled out the real thing. One foot in front of the other. See how he's kind of leaning forward though to support his weight right now. And then walks up and leans back. So it's forward, step, lean back. Anyhow. Yeah, I didn't use reference footage for any of the animation, so I mainly just kind of looked at the Sonic figure and I was like, okay, how does he hold his weight with his giant head and spikes, since we as humans do not have that, so I can't relate. It's probably a moment of history repeating itself, since I didn't use a reference to make the Sonic model. I was new to using a computer, so I just didn't want to spend 5 hours trying to figure out how to import a file into my computer and then into Blender. So I was like, you know what? I grew up drawing Sonic a lot. I know this character pretty well. I could probably model him myself, which might have been to my own detriment. But he looks great so long as you don't compare him to the real thing. Then I realized I could finally take off all the sticky notes I had stuck up on my monitor when I had all these things on weight painting and rigging that I was like, oh, I need to remember this. Let me write it down so I'll remember what I need to do the next day. Then the final tweaking the animation, I actually bothered to animate his quills kind of bouncing from his movement, and then of course animate the eyes kind of looking up and looking down as he's walking, add in some good blinking, all those little details to really make it a more crisp animation. And then it came to rendering it, and that happened. Looking into the problem, someone said if there's a duplicate of your object, maybe that's what's messing up the render. I realized what it was that I had some different versions of the mouth hidden, and it turns out that if you don't tell Blender to not render items you've hidden from your view, Blender will render them. So yeah, hid those from the rendering aspect, and then he had one mouth as he moved. So rendered all those images, put them in the Blender video editor, and then I had my first test animation, a good old classic walk cycle. I even overlaid one of my own drawings on top just to give it a neat texture. If you want to see that drawing, that's in the last video I've uploaded. Added a plane, gave it a 0 on the Z-axis, except I accidentally hit Y and it made my computer quit. I can't blame my computer. When I have to do math, my brain quits too. Yeah, so once I had the walk cycle done with the animation, I was ready to move on to some more serious animation. Set up an environment, but this box here was... Nobody puts Sonic in a box. Did help me realize I didn't want a toon shader for the environment and just its own dark color and just have the cool lights give it that neat rainbowy look. But instead of doing a box, I decided to do a more curved environment and add a subdivision surface modifier to it, which is basically just kind of condensing your shapes and giving it a more rounded look. So now Sonic had that giant bathtub he could run in. Also added lights to the bathtub environment, and then I realized while adding the lights that I wanted his main lights that I already gave him to kind of follow him, so I added a constraint so when he moves around the lights won't leave him. And then I took some snatch shots of him in his world where he's like, out of my way folks, it's time to do some jumping jacks. I scripted out kind of an idea for a scene I had, did some little small thumbnail storyboards. Since I had the world set up, it was time to kind of set up the layout. So creating some camera angles and posing him in positions to kind of see if I liked the camera angles to set up the animated scene. And you're going to see a lot of repeats of that, me tweaking things. So I'm going to leave myself room now to kind of give some backstory. I mentioned that I started exploring Blender with my sister's computer. Now, she didn't know I was using her computer, and I couldn't always use her computer, and it wasn't a computer that could handle the type of stuff Blender packs into it anyhow. I needed a computer that could handle more storage and data and stuff. So I did my research, found the computer I needed, and my dad lovingly made the investment in me and my future and bought the computer I needed to do the kind of Blender work. So truly, I really couldn't be doing any of this without him. So thank you, Daddy. But even during that time, there were things going on that I was working on other things and I didn't have time to sit down and learn Blender. And I also didn't have the motivation nor incentive ducks. So I didn't really get around to working consistently in Blender. However, I also didn't have any means of learning Blender in the way I wanted until I came across this Sonic tutorial, because I was looking for a tutorial on making a 3D animated character in Blender, except they were either too simple or too complicated, or they cost money to find the right one, and you still don't know if you're getting the right one because you'd have to pay for it and all that stuff. So finding this tutorial was perfect because Sonic's kind of a good in-between. He's kind of a complicated character, but he's not like too complicated like human. So I figured this was a pretty manageable tutorial. The funny thing was I had saved this tutorial series and I would always look at it and go, man, I wish this was the right tutorial series, but there's no voiceover. Well, here's the thing, there was the whole time. I just kept conveniently fast forwarding throughout the video where he had stopped talking in the narration because he didn't need to repeat what he just said. So I thought it was just like a time lapse of the person making the Sonic and not an actual tutorial. Yeah. So I just would say it wasn't time yet, but November of 2022, a lot of things prior had been ending in my life and things, friendships kind of fizzled and opportunities fizzled and everything like that. And the last thing I had was my violin lessons with this one teacher that I had been learning violin from for years. She never missed a day. Like only one time did I have a substitute from her and she warned me weeks in advance. And that was the last constant I had going on at that time. So of course, one day I show up for a violin lesson and discover that my violin teacher had quit. Even though the last time I had spoken to her in the last lesson, she said, see you next time. So, yeah. That left me pretty much down in the dumps, but December came along and I just was like, I've got nothing else. I gotta figure things out. And it gave me time to focus, and I ended up going back to looking into Blender tutorials and coming across the Sonic one again and realizing that there had been narration the entire time. And so I got started, and I would come back to it every couple of months. So it's not literally that I've been working on this for 2 years every single day or anything like that. It wasn't until December of last year that I was really trying to finish because I wanted to have it done before the new year, but I didn't, and then I kind of stopped doing it until February came along, and then I was more determined to finish it because I wanted to get the animation and this video done before my birthday, which I did, so yay! Want to see something borderline disturbing? So I copied some of the running animation from the beginning of this timeline, pasted it over here, but I didn't paste the location. So when he breaks through the wall, this happens. Long story short, I ended up getting a new violin teacher that I'm very happy with, but had it not been for the old violin teacher leaving, I don't know if I would have had time to just kind of focus in on what I really wanted to do and accomplish. And it's also very surreal that the first 3D character I've modeled and rigged and animated is Sonic the Hedgehog, because that was the first cartoon franchise I fell in love with as a kid. I distinctly remember being 3 years old, watching him run across the TV screen as my sister was flipping through channels, and it stuck. Stored him in the back of my brain, and then when I was 5, I saw my dad was on the Netflix website ordering DVDs. It asked me, was there any show I wanted to watch or anything, and I said, is there any show out there for Sonic? That's how I grew up on the 90s Sonic. I just can't shake that blue blur. He's way past cool. Taught me important life lessons like not to climb into a washing machine, although he didn't teach me to save my texture paint, so I'm a little bitter about that one. Currently what you're seeing is the rendering happen in time-lapse form. It was really cool to see all my animation frames get saved. He's about to give me his thumbs up of approval. 4 frames left now. 3, 2, 1. And done! Yeah! It's all done! It's all done! Now I just gotta put it together. I'm so excited. When I began working on this project, I told my mom about it, and she said, you know, it's always funny that it comes back to Sonic. Thinking back on that little Lily staring at the TV screen, I'm like, it is funny how it always comes back to that. I'd like to thank everyone who supported me in this. There's so many times working on this project that I just thanked God for giving me the understanding to do this, that he took this dummy and taught her Blender. All glory goes to him.